We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with Dave Patterson, continuing the discussion on Syria and the mess in the Middle East. Dave, thanks for sticking around. Now, I want to move this conversation onwards a little bit. So we've discussed what's happening in Syria and what we don't know about what's going to happen in Syria. We've discussed the Biden administration extremely premature response to all the unknown unknowns. But now I want to talk a little bit about what Donald Trump's up to here, because he's going to be the president soon enough. The once and future president, if you know your Mozart. And I can't remember the phrase that was written on the grave site there in the book. But anyway, the once and future president. So what is Trump's position here? And I guess, secondly, if you don't mind going into it, is why is Joe Biden taking such action right now when he is on the way out of the door?
Okay, let's take the first part of your question first. The reason he is because suddenly he woke up one day and said, my legacy is total failure. And so what can I do to improve that legacy? And the fact is, nothing. You had 3.5, 4 years to create goodness, and you didn't. People look back and they say, golly, let's see, Afghanistan. That was a failure. And then leading up to Ukraine, you could have had the opportunity to bolster the Ukrainians, and you did not. You didn't take advantage of the fact that you knew 60, 80, 90, 120,000 Russians were building up their forces on the border of Ukraine, and you did nothing. This is not something that you can suddenly, heal the wound, put a Band-Aid on it and say, wasn't I a great president? No, you were not.
It's funny that there's a lot in the, let's call it the more left-leaning legacy media. And they said there was nothing that really Joe Biden could have done to prevent the war in Ukraine because it's a foreign situation. And until something happened, there was no obligation, no legal culpability, no legal responsibility to really intervene. However, I mean, if we just strip away the political niceties, an enormous training exercise invited by President Zelensky to the US. Hey, we just want to do some training exercises in the Donbass regions, just to get our own forces in line.
Exactly. And at that time, you could have had like an amphibious landing at Mariupol, but of course now that's in Russian hands.
Yeah.
So there were lots of things that you could have done. And we now have an opportunity, having seen what happened in Georgia, and to prevent the Russians from basically annexing all of Georgia. And if you don't think that's a possibility, remember what happened in 2008 when we did nothing under the George Bush W. administration.
So let's talk about Donald Trump now. So he's going to be president soon enough, a few weeks time of recording. What's his position on Syria?
I think his position is an adult approach, and that is, we don't know what's going to happen. We have no idea what's in the minds of these people who have marched down the road to Damascus and captured it. Why don't we just sit back and watch before we do something precipitous and stupid? And I think that his focus is going to be on the American people first, as he has said. I mean, it's not as though he doesn't telegraph what he has in mind or what he intends to do. It's not a secret with Donald Trump. He tells you throughout his campaign what he has in mind. It was the same thing in the first administration. People simply weren't listening.
Yeah. So it's a very volatile situation in Syria, because you actually have Israel has now entered Syria. And that's the first time, I think, in 50 years or thereabouts. And so you have different forces on the ground. You have Israeli forces there. Now, Israel is obviously engaged in other theaters at present. But if you're amping up what the US is doing there, I don't see how there can't be some kind of, and I don't mean this in the Russian hoax collusion style, but if you've got two forces conducting operations and they're not enemies, there's got to be some kind of cooperation going on there. But then those cooperative missions suggest that the US is directly involved militarily with prosecuting Israel's war. And have I got that wrong, or is that?
Well, I think that you can make a distinction in that we don't have forces that are actively supporting Israel in its operations. We don't do that. However, we have forces in Syria that are working to get rid of ISIS and the ISIS remnants in Syria, and because those are mutually beneficial, as luck would have it, but they do support one another. But the U.S. is not supporting actively in operations Israel. That's not to say that we shouldn't. That's just to say that we're not.
Yeah, I think that would be a whole new bag of worms if I've messed that. A whole new can of worms.
Right.
A bag of cats, a can of worms, a satchel of doggies.
So metaphor spring.
There you go. So essentially what should be happening in Syria is that the US should be sitting back and waiting to see what kind of leadership emerges, because at the moment, I guess we've got Abu Muhammad al-Jilani, and he's essentially the de facto leader of everything that's now happening in Damascus. And it's my understanding that he will want to be present or leading whatever government emerges. Now I'm using the air quotes for those of you listening on just on the radio here, but that is a former terrorist now in charge of well, let's be fair, a very crucial place in the Middle Eastern region. And we have a situation where it seems as though the enemies, because obviously places like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and whatnot, we tend to think of them as, they're these Islamic fundamentalists and they've all got the same goal. But it's really very much a case of internecine warfare within that umbrella term. And they all hate each other. So the US appears to be, with its strikes, it's 75 more precision strikes, and that's just at the time of recording. We don't know what's coming down the pipeline the next couple of weeks. The US is in the process of wiping out this guy's enemies list.
I know it's somewhat perverse, right?
A little.
Yeah. I think that something that we can look at. So it's analogous to Mandela arising in South Africa. The first thing he did was amnesty for all of the enemies. The first thing al-Jilani does is go after the enemies that were part of Assad's army. That's a distinction that's going to be interesting to watch as time goes on.
We're going to be continuing this conversation in just a few short moments. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.